In the early 19th century, smuggling cost the government millions in lost revenue. One of the worst culprits was George Ransley and his gang. He made smuggling a highly organised crime, and by supplying the country with cheap booze, he became a folk hero.
Quicker we get that up and ashore, quicker we get a drink. Hey, Mr. Bailey. Right.
English smugglers would spend 10,000 guineas a week on buying contraband from the continent, equivalent to £750,000 today. And they'd make their money back easily because everyone hated paying import duties. Smuggled goods would be bought by all members of society, including the aristocracy. With such a fantastic opportunity to make money, the plan for each landing was worked out with military precision.
Right. If anyone blows a gab, my father-in-law, Mr. Bailey, will mill his canister. You got that? Right. At midnight, Mr. Huckstep here will give the signal. 1 flash if the coast is clear. 2 flashes if there's any blockade men around. You got that?
Yeah. 1 for clear, 2 for blockade men.
Right.
Lookout men would exchange signals with the smuggling vessel, and if danger threatened, they'd warn the ship to withdraw by flashing a light from a special lantern. There's one there. If it was too dangerous to land, the smugglers would use a technique called crop sewing, where they fasten the barrels onto a weighted length of rope and drop them off at a pre-arranged spot offshore. When the coast was clear, the smugglers, in an innocent-looking fishing boat like that one there, would hover above the spot and hook up the barrels using long hooked poles called creepers, which is what these fellas here are doing now. These are smugglers having a dry run, a kind of practice, coincidentally, as I'm telling you about it. Then they would bring them on shore and bury them under the sand until it was safe to collect them. But getting the tubs off the beach was still pretty risky. Ransley would organise landing parties of up to 300 men, tub men to carry the contraband and bat men to fight with any preventatives that turned up. As a second-in-command, Ransley's father-in-law and his ever-present threshing flail were pretty handy.
Come on! We haven't got all night!
300 men, that's a couple of villages, isn't it? How did you stop them from grassing you up, eh? You know, telling on you, telling tales, turning king's evidence, that kind of thing. Ah, my father-in-law is pretty good at stopping any cull's blubber. I expect his flail would stop them. Yeah. But mostly I paid him proper. 7 shillings beer and biscuits on a good night, 3 shillings on a missed night, which was a lot more than he was getting paid when they was working the land, so they knew it was good for him. And most of them liked to drop a cousin Jack as well.
Nearly all members of the community would take part in the operation in one way or another. Farmers who left their stable doors open at night would often find a package hidden in the hay in the morning. Even pillars of respectability would enjoy the forbidden fruit of smuggled goods. Vicars who liked to tipple would store barrels of brandy in their church crypts. And by supplying everyone, Ransley even had the top brass in his pocket. But Ransley didn't want his neighbours getting too involved. To keep nosy Parkers away from their hiding place at St Augustine's Priory, Ransley and his gang spread stories of a ghostly severed head.
Carry on doing that, darling.
Ransley's father-in-law, Samuel Bailey, probably acted as bouncer at the Bourne Tap, George's house. Ransley made a fast buck by selling contraband liquor. He didn't have a licence, but that didn't seem to bother most of the patrons who enjoyed the free-flowing drink and liberal environment.
She don't want to hear about that.
This one, I tell you, he's a wriggler.
By all accounts, George Ransley never took part in the fornication or drinking.
Weren't you tempted to consume some of the contraband? Nah, mate. A clear head to stay on top of business. Can't be going getting tipsy when you got staff to look after.
Staff? I thought it was a family business. I thought your father-in-law had the whole human relations thing pretty much covered. True, I got my son to be the secretary, but this was a big operation. Soon I had to take others on too. Such as?
An accountant, solicitors from Langham and Platt in Ashford, Dr. Ralph Petworth Howam. He was a doctor and he'd fix the men up if they'd had a run-in with the blockadesman, and if he couldn't fix them, I'd make sure the families were all right.
It was in Ransley's interest to look after his men. Their loyalty and that of the local population was key to moving contraband across country.
Sounds like preventatives, boys. After our blood, but they'll not be having us tonight. Give me one of those barrels. Take the horse into there, and I'll distract him. And keep quiet.
Ransley's many adventures with the blockade men boosted his status as a dashing outlaw and folk hero.
I knew the marsh and the land round Aldington like the back of my hand, so they had no chance of catching me.
But you managed to catch one of them?
Oh, yeah. We had jolly larks with him.
What did he do, George?
We blindfolded the snivelling little scab, marched him to the edge of a cliff and made him hang there till his arms nearly dropped off.
You killed him?
Nah. Cliff was barely higher than he was tall. The only damage done was to his ego. He cacked his farting crackers. We had a right old laugh.
Farting crackers?
Breeches.
For the first few years, Ransley was considered a latter-day Robin Hood, but when he started robbing local people instead of the government, sympathy began wearing thin. As Ransley's power increased, so did his brutality. He and his gang started using more and more violent methods to silence his enemies.
So it wasn't all japes and tomfoolery. We was just teaching him a lesson.
And what about this? It's just a rumour I've heard, but is this rumour true, that you threw one of your own men down a well?
Well, sometimes you got to be cruel to be kind.
Stack it here.
But on July the 30th, 1826, the tide of public opinion would turn. A popular local quartermaster named Richard Morgan was patrolling with his deputy, Pickett, when he spotted Ransley and his gang unloading contraband.
Pickett, Kilcrick, hold! I arrest you in the name of King George!
What sort of a gudgeon do you take me for? Shoot the bloody back!
Morgan was killed instantly. Pickett got off lightly. He was just beaten with cutlasses and musket butts. The rest of the Blues continued with their work. By the time Morgan's colleagues got to the scene, the gang had made their escape, leaving just a few tubs behind. Local people were already getting annoyed at the Aldington gang's brutality, and the killing of Morgan was the straw that broke the camel's back. The smugglers could no longer rely on protection by the locals, so when a hefty reward was offered, Ransley's days were numbered.
2 weeks. 2 weeks is all it took before a blabbermouth decided to turn King's evidence and turn me in. If I could get my hands on him, I'd...
Who was it?
Slippery little ill by the name of Edward Horn. Got caught smuggling at Walmer. Got 3 sovereigns and a speenie when he decided to save his neck in return for mine.
Horn would be pardoned, provided he made a full confession to one Lieutenant Hellard.
Shouted out to the gang and fired a warning shot.
That's right.
And then Ransley ordered his men to fire on Morgan.
Aye, and they beat up his mates, took the tubs back down to the Palm Tree Inn. Business as usual, even though they just killed a man.
Thank you.
Ransley's exploits had made him almost as famous as the celebrated highwayman Dick Turpin, and his capture was considered a major operation and was very carefully planned. On a stormy night in October 1826, Lieutenant Hellard led a couple of Bow Street runners and a group of preventatives to the Bourne Tap. They surrounded the house and, in the words of Hellard, took Ransley completely unawares.
George Ransley! In the name of King George, I arrest you for the murder of Richard Morgan! Come on! Restrain him!
taken to Newgate Prison in London because Hellard and the Bow Street men didn't trust the local jailers, thought they might be bribed, see? So it was going to be a big court case then. One of the biggest Maidstone I'd ever seen. The coaches were so full of people they'd change the horses every 10 miles. They all wanted to see my men hung, you see, but my lawyer, Mr. Platt, was a tricky one.
My lord, the defendants plead guilty to all charges apart from the murder of Richard Morgan.
The wily Mr. Platt fought valiantly on behalf of the gang, but the judge wasn't having any of it. And after a lengthy session, Mr. Justice Parks passed a sentence of death on Ransley and his gang. It seemed as if they were going to swing.
You will be taken to Tyburn and hanged until dead.
My lord, may I have a quiet word?
We don't know what was in the letter that the judge received, but it came from the Solicitor General in London. And the new ruling seemed to suggest that the bigwigs in town were worried that Mr. Platt might embarrass them by exposing their links with smuggling. The judge changed the sentence from death to transportation and summed up like this.
If persons of the highest station in life were not to buy smuggled goods, that would be the end to smuggling. But some persons labour under the delusion that defrauding the revenue is no crime at all.
It's true. Most people thought there's no harm in cheating the government because the government's cheating you. And I suppose it helped that some of the people who subscribed to this view were pretty powerful. Didn't do us no harm, that's for certain.
Instead of being put to death, Ransley was transported to Van Diemen's Land, current-day Tasmania. He arrived in Hobart in August 1827.
Ransley was granted a conditional pardon and was allowed to rent his own farm.
Where's your lunch, George?
I named one of them after you.
You're not funny, you know.
I'm sorry?
His wife had come out to join him, and together they raised a large family.
He died at the ripe old age of 78 from yellow jaundice in Tasmania. Or so they say. Some people believe that George came back to Aldington as an old man and is buried here in the Ransley family graveyard. Wherever he ended his days, when he passed on, the age-old tradition of Kentish smuggling started to die out as well.